Nancy Pelosi's been in that position, the leader of the Democrats in the House for at least 16 years, right? And so that's a long time. And Hakeem Jeffries could be that guy for a long time, and you don't want him there if you get into a position where you have control of the Senate again and you have a president, because those bodies are actually moving more to the left, it seems to me, at a pace that is faster than the House. And I don't know if that is your assessment of it as well, but the Senate, 10 years ago, the Senate was a much more conservative place for Democrats.
Oh, absolutely.
I would argue even the presidency, regardless of what's in their hearts or not, Joe Biden, his positions are to the left of Barack Obama's. It's not to be confused with him being, AOC, but his positions are to the left because the Democratic Party, the Democratic voters, are to the left of where they were, I think, also 10 years ago. But the House does not necessarily reflect that in the same way. We're seeing the sort of the squad and squad adjacent growing, but the center of the House still feels pretty conservative to me.
Well, I think you're right. I hadn't thought about that, actually. I hadn't really seen that, sort of unique comparison of where the House is compared to where I think I agree with you about the party and very much about the Senate. I mean, 10 years ago, Joe Manchin would not have been alone out there. There would have been a whole group standing behind him. Now, there were some whispering in his ear, some conservative Democrats, more conservative Democrats, but they were up front. And 10 years ago, they were more than willing to just step out and, pump their fists and say that
Joe Manchin would be behind them. He would be in the next row of those people who are
that's right.
fighting that fight.
That's right. And I mean, you go back to the 90s and most of the caucus was like that, the Democratic caucus in the Senate. It was a much more conservative body then, which is very interesting. And the fact that the House is seeming, there's a lot of things in the House that's symbolic, right? I mean, and especially in the Democratic caucus. I mean, and you have Jeffries there. He'll be the first Black Speaker of the House, which is very meaningful. And he's also an ostensible member of the Progressive Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus, both of which are presumed to be progressive. So, he gets that, like what you're saying is true. He is not a particularly progressive guy. He really isn't. He's a very kind of, establishment, corporate friendly mover and shaker type more than a ideological progressive. So, but he has all the sort of, identifiers that will make people feel comfortable. A lot of people feel comfortable. Well, he's one of us. I don't even know how they feel about that in the House itself. I assume that the more sophisticated ones understand this very well. But they're, let's just put it this way. A lot of members of the House of Representatives aren't particularly sophisticated. So there may be plenty of them there who don't really understand this dynamic and are just basically going, hey, go Hakeem. You're a good guy. He's from New York too. Right. I mean, there are a lot of things about him that sort of give that impression. And you're right, though. I mean, on an ideological basis, it has moved much less to the left. And I would maybe even argue that the progressives in the House have become much more, how shall I put this? Much more willing to play the game than they used to be. They're less willing to go up against as we're seeing maybe with, as Emma points out, this kind of, why aren't they fighting harder on this speakership? There are a lot of them, and yet they seem at this moment to be going along to get along. So you're seeing a lot more of that. It's very interesting. We'll have to watch how this unfolds over the next 2 years, because it's going to, as you say, the next 2 years are gone. I mean, legislatively speaking, I mean, there's nothing there. That they'll be, attending investigation hearings, and that's about it. That's what they'll be doing, and there'll be a fight over the debt ceiling. It appears that they don't have the votes in the Senate to raise the debt ceiling in the lame duck, which is a nightmare. But there will be, various things that they do. But for the most part, the Democrats have nothing to do for the next 2 years other than just kind of hold back the tide to as best they can. So we won't know, but it's going to be vitally important for the future. And I don't know if anybody's really seeing the the kind of roadblocks that are being put out there for the progressive project.
That question of how the progressives are positioning themselves in the House, I don't know if it's. I think that is very much, it seems to me, a story in development, right? Like I think there was a conscious decision at one point I think there's two things going on. I think there's like an attempt within the Congressional Progressive Caucus to solidify its power, and I would not be surprised if they get to a point where they start to kick people out and say, we're actually there's a membership requirement here, and it's not just like whatever $4,000 in fundraising. Right. That it is, we need your votes on this, and this. Yeah. And that's going to be our membership requirements, essentially, our qualifications. We're going to put some litmus tests on there so that we move. We have a little bit more nimbleness in terms of the way we move. We may be smaller, but we'll be more cohesive. Simultaneously, I think that we saw with the Build Back Better, machinations, that there's also an attempt. And I think we've seen some of this from AOC on some level to sort of build those bridges, because I think, a lot of these people are probably less ideological than we imagine on the sort of the more conservative end of the Democrat. I think they are conservative in the sense that within the context of the Democratic Party, they are corporatist within the context of the Democratic Party. But I don't think they're married to that as much as it is they just think that's normal and that's where their money comes from. Yeah. And I think that my sense in talking, we've had a couple of conversations with Ilhan Omar and one with AOC and things that I have read. I don't know if their strategy is right or wrong, but it's very clear to me that they have some type of strategy, and that it does feel at one point there was a decision to be made that was like, we're gonna start to try and build and exercise power, and that's not necessarily the same thing as making a public fight all the time. And I think on some level, we saw that transition a little bit with Bernie Sanders as he got where he found himself in a position he had legitimate power. There started to be a shift in the way that he approached things. He was no longer the conscience of the House, which is what I think he was referred to for the first 10, 15 years he was in there. Because now it could just be more than a conscience. He could actually be part of the brain that makes the arms and legs move. and so sometimes that's a trade-off. And it doesn't appear to be as public. This is all sort of speculation on my part, and I don't think we're going to know the answer to these questions, for some time. One wonders, if there is, because if we've known that Jeffries has been the guy for at least, since at least Crowley went down, then they've known. And so, it's almost insane to think about it, but a lot of this stuff is like personal relationships. And
for sure.
Jamal Bowman came out very early and supported Hakeem Jeffries. And I just don't think that it's not because they're aligned in terms of where they, with their voting records or not, or were they aligned in terms of their positions, I guess. And so it could be interesting, if this is if there is a greater amount of practicality associated with these folks. You got people go ahead.
I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, when I listen to AOC and Ilhan Omar, both of them, it's interesting that you bring them up because I think they are the two that are sort of the bellwethers of where the progressives are and are going. The real progressives, not the ones that just sign on with the $4,000 checks. And I sense a much greater level of sophistication in the way that they're approaching this than, which is natural, right? I mean, they came in with a certain mandate of progressivism, and they started to learn. They're both very smart and started to learn how the levers of power work and started to understand how to do that. I don't think you really get that until you're there, right? I mean, it takes
I will
some
say
exposure.
People forget Ilhan Omar was in the leadership in the Minnesota House.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
That's
so
right.
in the Minnesota House, I mean, so she had a sense of this stuff, I think, going in. And, I think AOC is just, I think, incredibly bright and is really has picked up on this. And I think has, learned through a little bit trial and error, too. But yeah, I think they're in there, and this is a long-term plan, I think.
Well, I think so too, and I think that to me, that this is where the future is in this particular group. I don't mean specifically the squad, but people, of that generation of politicians that came into office, and I think that they have learned. And not just from looking at the Democrats, they've learned from watching the Republicans as well. I mean, we can talk about them too, which is an even more interesting leadership study. It's, but I'm very, very interested in seeing what AOC, Elon, and the rest of that crew end up doing, because I'm watching exactly what you described, and I'm very intrigued by what I'm seeing there, because I think it could be a very interesting thing for us if it carries on. Because so far I have a lot of trust in their integrity. I haven't seen, any kind of real, the usual sort of compromises on character that you tend to see in politics. So, I'm hopeful on that count.